And for more now, we're joined by Mohamed Ali. He is a Syrian journalist based in Damascus. He's reported from major war zones in Syria, including from Aleppo and Homs. Also with us here in the studio is journalist Rasha Elass. She has reported from the Middle East for over 10 years, including the war in Syria. Welcome to both of you to the show. Mohamed, Russia announced a few days ago that it will be pulling its main force out of Syria. The Russian President Vladimir Putin saying that the Russians had achieved their objectives. How has that news been received in Syria, and what is your understanding of what objectives have been achieved?
Yes, according to the recent statements by the Syrian presidency, let's say the presidential office, it pointed out that this was not a surprising decision. This is something that was discussed and coordinated between the Syrian and Russian leadership due to the situation on the ground. And of course, here when we hear the Russians saying that they have accomplished, let's say, their mission here, they mean that they have, to a great extent strengthened the positions of the Syrian army forces across the country against terrorist groups. Particularly here we're speaking about ISIL and al-Nusra Front. According to the Russians, we know that about 10,000 square kilometers were liberated because of the Russian aerial support to the Syrian forces on the ground, and also over 200 towns and villages were also secured by the Syrian army with the support of the Russian warplanes. Now, this is very important. We know that Russia, since the beginning, said and made it clear that it is not coming forever in Syria. It is coming to assist the Syrian army to eliminate the threat of terrorism. Particularly here we're speaking about areas close to central Syria and Latakia, and this indeed has happened, and the Syrian army is much more stronger now on the ground. I believe that the Russians have sent a very important message to both friends and enemies, particularly to Washington, that it was serious in actually fighting terrorism. It has done a lot in this extent, unlike the US-led coalition, and also it made it clear that it will be pulling out its major force, also to pave the way for a political solution on the ground. However, we have to point out to the most important fact here, which is that despite the Russians pulled out most and the basic force over here, there are still warplanes fighting terrorism with the Syrian army. Just yesterday and today, Russian warplanes and fighter jets have been pounding the positions of ISIL near Palmyra, where the Syrian army is advancing, and expectations is that perhaps in the coming few days, Palmyra could be secured.
Okay. Russia, what is your understanding of the military status of this war right now? Has the Syrian government, as Mohammed is pointing out, recovered all this territory that was previously being held by Islamic State?
Yeah, well, let's make one thing clear. I don't think anyone believes that the Russians are actually targeting ISIS territory. Everyone has seen the maps and has seen the numbers. Most of the casualties from the Russian airstrikes have been civilians or people in non-ISIS country. What has happened is that in some parts of Syria, the Russian airstrikes actually made way for the Syrian regime troops to advance. Like, for example, in the northern side of Aleppo city and in other parts of the country. But but to think that Russia has sort of come onto the international stage and left as sort of victorious as as the main fighting power against ISIS, nobody believes that. But what Russia has managed to accomplish with these airstrikes is that they're now a main player in brokering the peace talks with the Assad regime. And what's really interesting is if you talk to Moscow insiders, they will tell you, listen, Moscow is not married to Assad. We do want to get a solution. We have very clear interests in Syria that we will protect.
In a sense,
but Assad is not the only one who will protect us.
In a sense, is that a message to the United States that the road to peace actually goes through Moscow?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Russia has been trying to do this for some time. And I think as soon as it managed to free up some resources from Ukraine and other parts of the world, it went in full on to sort of, create a legacy with Syria.
Right. Mohammed, let's look at the peace process. Peace talks are underway right now in Geneva. Some have referred to these current round of peace talks as Syria's moment of truth. What are the chances of the talks succeeding this time?
Well, the Syrian government has made it clear since the beginning of the unrest almost that it is actually willing to find a peaceful solution for the Syrian crisis. However, we know that the so-called opposition groups, especially those that are linked to Saudi Arabia's decisions, only want President Assad to leave power. And this is something that the Syrian government has made it clear that it will not discuss, because this is something in the end which is up to the Syrian people themselves and up to the elections inside the country, as no one has the right to choose who's the president or not except for the Syrian people. This is actually has been the problem since the beginning. The countries who are against Syria, against the Syrian government, like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and also opposition groups who have been formed actually in those countries and who are known to be influenced by those countries, they also call for the same for the same thing. But in the end, the Syrian government is now again engaged in peace talks in Geneva. We know that just a while ago, Bashar al-Jafari, head of the Syrian government's delegation there, met with Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy to Syria, and he presented a worksheet, let's say, which includes what al-Jafari said, basic elements for finding a solution to the Syrian unrest. I believe those elements or principles are basically the same, preserving the unity of Syria and having dialogue without intervention. But in the end, I believe if a political solution should succeed, both sides should be discussing on the table of dialogue the main problems and not being influenced by any kind of country, whether regional or international country. Only Syrians themselves should decide how to share power, how to be living together inside Syria, just like before the unrest.
Right. Rasha, what do you make of that? Only the Syrian people can decide who should be running Syria. These UN-sponsored talks that are taking place right now, it is a Syrian-led process, and it wants to establish here credible, inclusive, non-sectarian governance, which would ultimately lead to free and fair elections in about 18 months.
Absolutely. Only Syrians can and should decide about the future of their country. Unfortunately, so many players are now involved in Syria, and that includes Russia and Iran, who are staunch allies of the Assad regime. And of course, it includes Saudi and the Gulf states and Turkey and everyone else. So, you know, to say that only Syrians should make this decision, that would be great, but it's a little too late for that, especially with the peace talks. So let's get everyone on the table, everyone and their proxies who are on the ground, and let's keep in mind that when we say let all Syrians decide, let all Syrians decide, and I mean all, everyone, the Syrians who are in rebel territories, the Syrians who are displaced, the Syrians who are refugees, the Syrians who are detained and still in the regime prisons for political reasons. Let all those Syrians decide. And that's, I think, a major, major point that the Assad regime is still not accepting.
Do you think the United States now has to give up its primary demand that Assad step down before there's some kind of political settlement reached in Syria?
You know, I don't think it matters who makes that demand. Yeah. The voice is very clear in Syria. I mean, if you're anti-Assad, you want him to step down. But even if you're pro-Assad, I think Assad and the regime has sort of let you down in so many ways, because the country, you know, he has failed to keep the country together. He's failed to protect the Syrian people. He's failed to protect his own people. And he's failed to give guarantees for his people what will happen if and when, you know, he's out. Nobody will stick around forever. So, you know, if you're not anti-Assad and you're pro-Assad, you know, I would wonder, is Assad really competent enough to stay in the job? I would say no.
And Mohammed, what would be your response to that?
Well, I don't believe that the Syrian president or the Syrian army failed in protecting the Syrian people. In the end, this is an army which is facing terrorists coming from over 80 states, from the borders from Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, from all around the world. And this was something declared by many countries. Now, this is a fact on the ground. You have terrorists flooding in from over 80 states to Syria to fight including, of course, those of al-Nusra Front and ISIL. So actually keeping the country, keeping the Syrian government and institutions on the ground up till this moment, having the salaries being paid to the government employees, Syrians living normal life, going to schools and work. This is in itself is an accomplishment for the Syrian government. This is not a regular war. This is not something that has happened.
Syrians are not going around their normal life, except maybe in some parts of a government-run Damascus and some parts along the coast and some small, tiny part of government-run Homs. And the rest of the country, Syrians are trying to govern themselves under airstrikes and constant bombardment.
I suggest that you come to Syria before speaking from where you are.
Okay.
If you come to Syria, you see them living a normal life, and you see the mortars falling from militant-held areas.
We need to get this past
that, they're
this
still
idea
living
that
a
if you come,
normal
I come
life.
to Syria all the time, and we hear this all the time that the terrorists did it, the terrorists did it, and that's fine. But I think a competent regime will be able to protect its country from so-called terrorists outside. I mean, the regime has failed to do even that.
Mohammed, I want to move to another political development. That is,
no country can keep what I'm saying is that there is no country in the world, if it faced the same what Syria faced, could actually keep all of its land secured. This is something for sure. You have all countries neighboring Syria working against it and providing all kinds of arms and facilitations on the borders. How in the world would be the Syrians living all across Syria in peace? But the Syrian government has made it possible.
If I can just interject one point, no president in the world says that his country is not for Syrians. President Assad said Syria is not for Syrians, Syria is for the people who protect it. I mean, it just goes above and beyond the imagination.
Okay, Mohammed, I want to move on to one other political development, and that is sorry, one moment.
This is not something what the president said. Every time the president makes an interview, the West speaks contrary to what he means.
All right. The Kurds have declared the setting up of a federal system. This would unite the Kurdish provinces in Syria. Is that something that's going to be acceptable in Syria?
Definitely not. If it's not under the framework of the unity of Syria and under the framework of a sane united Syria, this is rejected. The Syrian Foreign Ministry has made it clear that this is not something agreed on and not something that it would accept. If you actually have the Syrians actually decide if they accept having Syria divided, they will definitely not accept that. I mean, the entire purpose of defending Syria, for the Syrian government actually, is to keep it united, is to keep a united country together. So having any kind of Kurdish federation or division in Syria, this is not going to be something agreed on or accepted by the Syrian government. And also, this is not accepted by Russia or the United States.
Let me get Russia's view on that very quickly. Will Syria be able to hold as a unitary state, or are we going to see a kind of federal breakup?
I think the average Syrian wants the country to remain united, and I have to hold the opposition to that because they haven't done such a great job at sort of bringing in the Kurds and envisioning a Syria that's not just an Arab nation, but really a nation for all Syrians.
Right, and that is something that both of you agree on.